maybe I used to be a new atheist saying that God is some celestial dictator. And maybe he is a celestial dictator, but I think maybe the celestial part sort of undermines the badness of the dictator part. Who knows? But, you shake that off and you say, okay, look, religion isn't all evil. Heaven isn't some kind of North Korea. It's actually a quite pleasurable sounding experience. If there are such things as sort of moral truths, then I want to apprehend and follow them, and I want to worship that which deserves to be worshipped, and I want to see my family and friends again. The whole works. I'm just not convinced. I just don't think it's true. I've listened to arguments, and maybe I've had an irrational response to them, but I've tried my best. And if I'm limited only by my cognitive capacity, then I can hardly be blamed for that. Maybe I should have tried harder in school, but that seems like a quite loose basis on which to balance my soul for eternity. And I think that in itself would be something of a problem of evil, one of the many problems of evil. Okay, so here's the situation that I'm in, and this is the situation that many people are in. And it may not be the case that I'm truly seeking properly. It may be that I'm what Schellenberg has called a resistant non-believer. That is, your person who sort of has some kind of proactive defensiveness. And this is certainly true of many people, but so long as there is a single example, it doesn't have to be me, of somebody who sincerely seeks but doesn't find an answer, then what I'm looking for, I suppose, is either an explanation for that, an explanation of that experience, some kind of second-order explanation which makes that not a problem to worry about, or itself what I'm doing wrong so as not to experience that. A question that I often ask is what you would do if you woke up tomorrow, sort of in my mind, as it were, you just found yourself convinced that the arguments don't run anymore in the way that you've heard about conspiracy theories that the moon landing was fake, but you just sort of, you intuitively think it's ridiculous. And even if you start to look into them a bit, you think, no, there's no way these are true. And if somehow the eternity of your soul was predicated upon you accepting that the moon landing didn't occur. And I'm not trying to say that the arguments for God are of the same caliber, but by analogy, something that, look, arguments do exist, and they're discussed ad nauseum on the internet. But when you listen to them, you don't get to choose not to be convinced by them. You're just not. If that's the case, I ask, if you found yourself in that situation, what would you change? What is it, in other words, that I might be doing wrong?
Yeah. I suspect I probably agree with you on the paper-thin quality of human volition. I think that in past generations, human volition has been described as something Herculean or colossal, and I just don't think that's really tenable. I think more often it's a matter of we're dealt a hand, and then we're asked to play the hand. The rules of the game are somewhat simple, not overly complex, but that we can choose to play the hand, even if it seems like a losing hand. We can play it with a kind of, whimsy or panache. And I think that that's largely what freedom amounts to. So I'm not saying that everyone has opinions which they find to be perfectly malleable or revisable. Like, for instance, there's just the fact of human investment. Think of like a Protestant pastor who is thinking about becoming Catholic. That's his livelihood, And you might say perhaps it's better not to involve oneself, like by way of livelihood, in a thing that you might decouple yourself from in subsequent, months or years. But that's not humane. We all do that. We all hitch our wagon to whatever it is. So I think that, one thing I would say is this. With respect to our rank in creation, and then with respect to differentiation amongst human beings, I would say that we're called to live this life. So not the life of rocks, or of plants, or of animals, or of angels, but of men. And so, like when St. Thomas, for instance, describes the movement proper to each, echelon or rank, he'll say God, makes no movements. Insofar as movement for him, is an expression of coming to be. He says angels, they come to their end by one movement, whereas men come to their end by many movements. So I think that there can be a kind of tendency to falsify our human experience by focusing on certain moments of it, or even like tranches of it, when truth be told, it's over the course, right? It's discursive, it's diachronic. And I think that we have two modes in which we operate, the living of our lives and then the interpreting of our lives. Some people might want to break that into further modes still. But I think that we learn to live our lives well, and we also learn to interpret our lives well. And as time passes, provided we're doing so sincerely, I would add in Christian context, by the grace of God, we get better at interpreting our lives. So, like, for instance, if you had asked me in 2010, like, why did you become a Dominican friar? I would have told you like a hoorah story. It would have sounded like an army recruitment story. And you'd be like, that's precious. 13 years in, like, I'm not utterly ground down, but I have had to suffer more for it. And as a result of which, the story that I'm going to tell you is different. And that doesn't mean that the story that I told you 13 years ago was necessarily false. It was, and nor was it just wholly perspectival. It's like, I can't relate to myself back then. No, there's continuity, there's narrative continuity. But I would say that it's deeper, it's subtler, and I've picked out certain hues on the palette which I didn't perceive earlier, in part because of the way that life seasons your experience or kind of draws out the flavor of your experience. And so I think too, like, for you now, that's probably, I mean, like, I don't want to make it too terribly personal because then it just becomes somewhat inextricable, But I also think that, like, patience, not just in the mere, the virtue that is commended to us by our schoolroom nannies, but patience in the sense of, like patio or pottery, like to suffer life well, not to be dramatic about it, but like a lot of life is endurance. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the virtue of courage, he says there are two principal parts, the attack dimension and the endure dimension. He says the endure dimension is the principal part because life is hard in effect and because we need to bear up. And he breaks it out into two further pieces, which are patience and perseverance. Patience, which bears up under sadness, which I would say is one of the principal obstacles of living in the 21st century. And then perseverance, which sees it through to the end. So I think that there's something to the time-bound nature of our lives and God, his revelation interfacing with the time-bound nature of our lives, which forces us to kind of undergo it or to, like, recognize and receive it with a certain patience.
Okay, in the context of what I'm talking about, that is the evil, if God does exist, seemingly, or the sort of ostensible, apparent evil of people being withheld from communion with him.
Yeah.
In the context of speaking about that, taking a more holistic approach to a person's life might be helpful, but there are still, I think, quite jarring problems with this. For example, I presume you believe in libertarian free will.
What the thing that I hold for antedates, like the distinctions in which we currently traffic,
Sure,
and so I'm just a troll.
human beings get to
Choose stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so perhaps it's the case that I'm on some kind of grand theological journey. And that is that maybe when I turn 45, I'm going to see my sort of waterfall split into 3 streams and fall to my knees and accept Christ. Problematically, Cameron sat over there has libertarian free will. He could choose to stand up and stab me in the throat and kill me now.
Yeah.
I would die. I would come before God and I would fall short. And I wouldn't have accepted the sacrifice of Jesus. If I am being used in some kind of, well, I shouldn't say used, if I'm part of some kind of grand theological journey, is the way I worded it, this can be cut short by another human being's actions and presumably, therefore, also cut off the road to redemption. Now, some people have suggested to me when I pointed this out that, well, okay, because people sometimes say to me that it's a good job I'm an atheist because when I finally convert to Christianity, I'll provide such a great story for people to look to. It would be some kind of road to Damascus-esque, narrative that people can refer to. Fine. Firstly, I feel like I'm being sort of used as a bit of a pawn.
Yeah.
But secondly, if that is the case, this can be cut short by another human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes people then say to me, well, if that were to happen, God would know what you would have done. They take a sort of Molinist view or something. They say, well, look, of course, if you die now, you're not making it to heaven. But God knows that if you would have stayed alive, that's what you would have done. And so you get to heaven on that account. If that's the case, then I don't see the point in this veil of tears altogether, because there's no point in running the exam if God already knows what everybody's going to get, if you know what I mean. So I'm not sure if what you were saying was a direct response to my point that people live with essentially the suffering of this privation of communion with God. Even looking at it as a journey, even if I look at it as something that could potentially develop over time, this is something that can be trivially cut short by another human being's actions. All of this put together just ascribes an arbitrariness and triviality to the conditions under which my eternal soul either receives this unimaginably pleasurable communion with goodness itself, or whatever your sort of doctrine of the afterlife for those who are not so lucky is. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're an annihilationist. Even that, compared to the infinite goodness of communion with God, is, a sort of infinitely bad outcome. These problems, people have syllogized them. They've sort of been a bit analytical about it. They've done premise, conclusion. But can you feel the arbitrariness, the triviality of what I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
And so if I were you in a situation of thinking, okay, there are lots of people on planet Earth who are seeking very, very desperately, and they're not finding God, but I've got a relationship with him. I'd say lucky me. And you probably do say lucky me. But lucky you is unlucky me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think needs to be accounted for.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so like a couple of speculative backstops and then maybe some more practical or existential things to advance, I suppose. So the one would be that this vision, the hierarchical nature of creation or the differentiated nature of creation, and also differentiation within the ranks, like our human rank, it pertains to the wisdom of God as to see it through. So like taking an example, from Revelation, Catholics believe in a doctrine of predilection, namely that God loves everyone the same, but that he loves some people in a certain sense more than others, insofar as he accords them greater goods. So prima pars question 20, article 3, it's scandalous, but it's also somewhat beautiful seen from a particular angle, insofar as the point of the differentiation of the goods accorded to those who occupy the rank of human is for like an organic end, insofar as he describes it in the context of the mystical body of Christ. So it's not like, it's not so much better and worse as it is like heart and lungs. Now, mind you, you're going to look at the thing and you're going to see the person who was born blind and club-footed and, with all sorts of sufferings, and you're going to say, I'm sorry, heart and lungs, this is decidedly better and worse. And yet, and this is where I think that, a defense sometimes works better than a straight theodicy, insofar as you can tell a story of that person's life, not in every case, obviously, but in some cases, whereby God will use even that. Not in the sense that God visited this thing because we have sufficient material conditions whereby to account for the fact that nature fails. It obtains always or for the most part, and that God, entrusting creation to a certain kind of set of conditions, as it were, admits for this possibility, but in light of a glory that lies in store, without chewing up and spitting out those who are involved in it as if they were mere pawns. So like, on the one hand, you've got this doctrine of predilection, so differentiation in the goods given, but then on the other hand, you have it in a personalistic whole, the idea that it's for the other. So like the Blessed Virgin Mary, for instance, I believe that God loves her most of those who are not God. And I don't begrudge her that, in part because it's glorious, and it's like something to behold, and in part because she's my mother. And, like not to get like touchy-feely about it, but I know that in a certain sense, the graces accorded to her are also graces given to me, insofar as she mediates them with some facility and with some tenderness, and I've encountered that in my life, and that can be part of a story. But that if this is from the unsearchable depths of the wisdom of God, in light of predilection, in such a way as to, like account for what we deal with here, like we're never going to get to the bottom of it, but that by continuing to ask the question, right, we can get a hint of it, or we can get a kind of indication of it. I'll stop there.
I'm wondering how this consideration functions as a response to this. I think the problem is quite specific.
Okay.
That is, if there's a God who wants to come to know me,
Yeah.
and I want to come to know him,
Yeah.
and he has the power to bring about the conditions that he knows would lead to my conversion,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm proactively seeking those to the best of my ability, and even if it's not me, somebody else might be doing this, and they don't find him, I can sort of understand the idea that God might love Mary more than another human being. God might love you more than me more than you. Who
Yeah.
knows? But the question I think that I'm wanting to get to the bottom of is, why are there some people who seem completely excommunicated in that they reach out and just can't find?
Yeah. So I'd say some things are beyond their control, but some things are also within their control. And so, again, Catholic dogma, it's been pronounced upon, which I take for a kind of epistemological backstop, that if one goes to heaven, it's by God's predestinating grace. If one goes to hell, it's because he has freely rejected that. So there's at least some way in which it can be said that by an exercise of free will, a grace which was offered was rejected. And so it's not necessarily like the grace of justification, but the Catholic teaching is that graces are kind of daisy-chained together.
Yeah.
Right? So they're, if you want to...
I wanted to ask what your view of hell is, not in too much detail. I just want to know what we're talking about here when you talk about hell.
The absence of God. So God continues to be present by essence, presence, and power, in the sense that God continues to give being and agency, but one is entirely distant from the life of grace and has foreclosed on the possibility of the life of grace.
And
so
do you think this is a sort of a form of suffering? Do you think it's a sort of conscious torment, not of the kind of flames and brimstone, but a consciously endured suffering?
I think it is. Yeah, I'm not an annihilationist.
And for eternity?
I do.
Okay. So there was something I wanted to ask about when you were talking about people freely rejecting this gift. Do you think, as I do, that if it is true that this place, hell, exists, and that you somehow know you're going there and know the means to escape it, but choose not to do that anyway, that you are almost necessarily acting irrationally?
Yes. I mean, insofar as all sin is contrary to right reason, I think there's a kind of irrationality at the heart of it.
So my issue with this is that I think the only reason why somebody could possibly make that decision is if they either don't fully understand the situation or aren't convinced that it's true. Reason being that I think if you showed somebody hell and they knew that it existed, they knew with 100% certainty that it existed, and they knew that the way to avoid this is to, throw your life on Christ. People might struggle to varying degrees, but I don't even know if it would be possible for a person to not choose to at least try to do that. Now, you might want to say, Satan chose to fall away from God even though he had full knowledge. I mean, this is a poetic story, but I don't know if such a person could actually exist in reality. And that's because I think that what we're dealing with is essentially a form of threat, although I know you're not going to want to sort of view it in those terms, but there's some philosophical literature on the difference between an offer and a threat, and it's actually quite difficult to pull apart. Like, you can phrase it as, I'm going to offer you $1 million a year more to change your job, and that sounds like an offer, but it also kind of sounds like saying, there's a way of sort of thinking it in your mind of like, well, if you don't do this thing, then I'm going to sort of I'm going to prevent you from having $1 million that you otherwise could have had. It seems like you're almost being threatened. Now, there are various ways to get around this, but the literature is that I remember having read at university, it was far more like surprising in terms of the responses it has to the obvious answers that might spring to mind. At any rate, it seems to me a bit like something like that's going on, where this is, it's not just a good offer, it's goodness. You're being offered goodness. And if a person fully apprehends that that's what's on offer, I think it's impossible to rationally choose to reject it. And what that means is that the only people who could reject that, in my view, are people who are acting irrationally. And generally when sort of somebody's rationality goes wrong, it's not exactly their fault. In fact, that's kind of like what irrationality is. It's like the reasoning faculty has gone wrong. It's not like you've reasoned it and you've got it rationally correct, you just choose not to. Irrationality means that hasn't happened. Otherwise, I think that somebody must just not be convinced that this is actually the case. In either case, I don't think it's fair that somebody can be sent to hell.